I was 30 seconds into clearing my driveway with my brand new electric snowblower when I saw her marching across the street like a general heading into battle. The morning sun reflected off the fresh powder that had dumped 8 inches on our Colorado Springs neighborhood overnight, and all I wanted was to get my driveway cleared before heading to work. But Susan Fitzgerald, president of the Pinewood Hills Homeowners Association, had other plans. "Turn that thing off," she shouted over the hum of my machine, her breath creating angry little clouds in the freezing air. I killed the motor and pulled my ear protection down around my neck. "Good morning to you too, Susan. Don't good morning me, Sam. That machine is creating a noise disturbance. It's not even 7 o'clock yet." I glanced at my watch. "It's 7:15. And I checked the HOA bylaws. Noise restrictions don't start until 10 p.m. and end at 6 a.m. on weekdays." Her face, already pink from the cold, turned a deeper shade of red. "That thing is still too loud. I'm writing you up." "For what?" "Following the rules. For excessive noise during reasonable hours. The board will be in touch." She spun on her expensive winter boots and stalked back to her house, which sat directly across from mine like a surveillance post. I stood there in my driveway, snow still covering half of it, wondering what I'd done to deserve this level of petty tyranny. I'd moved into Pinewood Hills 6 months ago, attracted by the mountain views and the reasonable HOA fees. What I hadn't counted on was Susan Fitzgerald and her band of busybodies who seemed to spend every waking moment looking for violations. 3 days later, an official letter arrived in my mailbox. The HOA was fining me $500 for excessive noise pollution and threatening additional fines if I continued to use my snowblower during unreasonable hours. The letter cited a vague clause about maintaining neighborhood tranquility and respecting the peace of fellow residents. I read it twice, then called my neighbor, Ted Morrison, who'd lived in the community for 10 years. "Oh yeah, Susan's done this before," he said when I explained the situation. "She went after the Hendersons 2 years ago for their kids playing basketball in their driveway. Said the bouncing ball was disturbing her afternoon meditation sessions. What happened? They paid the fine. Most people do. It's easier than fighting." "Well, I'm not paying it," Ted chuckled. "Good luck with that. Susan doesn't back down, but neither did I." That evening, I pulled out my laptop and started documenting everything. I researched Colorado HOA laws, read through our community's bylaws 3 times, and started keeping a noise log. If Susan wanted a fight, she'd get one with evidence and facts on my side. The next morning, I was up early with my phone's decibel meter app ready. At exactly 6:30 a.m., the landscaping crew that serviced the common areas rolled up with their industrial mowers, leaf blowers, and edgers. They worked for the HOA, maintaining the entrance, the small park, and the landscaping around the community center. I stood on my porch and measured. The leaf blowers registered between 90 and 95 decibels. The commercial mowers hit 88. Even from inside my house with the windows closed, I could hear them clearly. They worked until nearly 9 a.m. every Tuesday and Friday, and had been doing so since before I moved in. That same morning, I took my electric snowblower to my garage and measured it. With my phone at the same distance I'd measured the landscaping equipment, my snowblower registered 72 decibels. Not exactly library quiet, but significantly lower than the equipment the HOA itself used. I documented everything with photos, videos, and time-stamped recordings. Then I drafted a formal response to the HOA, including all my evidence, and hand-delivered it to Susan's mailbox. In the letter, I pointed out the hypocrisy and requested the fine be rescinded. I also noted that if the HOA believed 72 decibels was too loud, they should reconsider their landscaping equipment choices. A week passed with no response. Then 2 weeks. I continued using my snowblower when needed, each time documenting the decibel levels. Colorado's winter was in full force, and we were getting snow every few days. In early February, I received a second letter. The HOA was now fining me $1,000 for the original violation, plus additional uses of my snowblower. They'd also scheduled a hearing for the following month, where I'd be required to appear before the board to answer for my continued violations. The hearing was set for March 15th at 7 p.m. in the community center. I spent the intervening weeks preparing like I was going to trial. I purchased a professional-grade decibel meter, the kind used by sound engineers and noise compliance officers. It cost me $300, but I figured it was worth it if it saved me from paying bogus fines. I also did something else. I filed a formal complaint with the Colorado HOA Regulatory Office about the selective enforcement and requested mediation. Colorado had reformed its HOA laws a few years back, giving homeowners more recourse against abusive boards. The morning of the hearing, I received a call from a woman named Patricia Chen from the State Regulatory Office. "Mr. Fletcher, I'm calling about your complaint against the Pinewood Hills HOA. Yes, thank you for getting back to me. I've reviewed your submission and the documentation you provided. I'd like to attend your hearing tonight as an observer, if that's acceptable to you. More than acceptable. That would be great. I should mention that we've had 3 other complaints about this HOA in the past 18 months. Your case, combined with the pattern we're seeing, warrants our attention. This was news to me. What were the other complaints about? I can't share specifics, but let's say your situation isn't unique. I'll see you tonight." At 6:45, I walked into the community center with a folder full of documentation, my professional decibel meter, and a recording device. The room was set up like a small courtroom, with a table at the front for the board members and chairs arranged in rows for residents. Susan sat in the center of the board table, flanked by 4 other board members I recognized from the neighborhood. To her left was Brenda Winters, the vice president, a woman in her late 50s who always wore too much jewelry. Next to her was Kenneth Walsh, the treasurer, a retired accountant who looked perpetually nervous. On Susan's right sat Margaret Chen, no relation to Patricia, I assumed, and Robert Davidson, both relatively quiet members who seemed to go along with whatever Susan wanted. About 15 other residents had shown up to watch. Ted gave me an encouraging nod from the 3rd row. At exactly 7 p.m., Patricia Chen walked in. She was younger than I expected, maybe early 40s, wearing a professional blazer and carrying a tablet and briefcase. She introduced herself to Susan, showed her credentials, and took a seat in the front row. Susan's confident demeanor faltered for a moment, but she recovered quickly. "Let's begin. We're here tonight to address the continued violations by Mr. Sam Fletcher of 2847 Pinecrest Drive regarding excessive noise disturbances. Before we start," I said, "I'd like to submit additional documentation for the record." I handed copies of my noise measurements, photos, videos, and research to each board member. As you'll see, I've conducted extensive testing that shows my electric snowblower operates at 72 decibels, which is quieter than normal conversation at 3 feet and significantly quieter than the landscaping equipment this HOA employs. Susan barely glanced at the papers. "This isn't about comparative noise levels. This is about you disturbing the peace of the neighborhood." Then I'd like to know specifically which neighbors I've disturbed, and I'd like them to testify to that effect. That's not how this works. Patricia spoke up from the front row. Actually, Miss Fitzgerald, in matters of enforcement, the board should be prepared to show evidence of actual harm or violation. Mr. Fletcher's request is reasonable. Susan's jaw tightened. We received a complaint. From whom? I asked. That information is confidential. So I'm being fined based on an anonymous complaint, with no actual evidence that I've violated any specific rule. Brenda jumped in, her bracelets jangling as she gestured. You violated the noise ordinance, which states that noise restrictions apply between 10 p.m. and 6 a.m. I've never used my snowblower during those hours. Every single use has been documented, and all have occurred between 7 a.m. and 8 p.m. Kenneth cleared his throat nervously. Well, there's also the clause about maintaining neighborhood character and preventing disturbances. That's a subjective standard, I said. And even if we're applying it, my equipment is objectively quieter than the equipment the HOA itself uses. I have measurements from last week showing your landscaping crew's leaf blowers hitting 95 decibels. That's 23 decibels louder than my snowblower. That's different, Susan snapped. That's necessary maintenance. And clearing my driveway isn't necessary. Should I just leave 8 inches of snow blocking my garage? A few chuckles rippled through the audience. You could hire someone to do it, Margaret suggested quietly. Why should I pay someone to do something I can do myself with equipment I already own? Equipment that's quieter than what professionals use, by the way. Susan banged her gavel. We're getting off track. The board has determined that you're in violation. We're here to determine the consequences. With all due respect, Patricia said, standing up, that's not quite accurate. Mr. Fletcher requested this hearing to contest the violation itself. You haven't established that a violation occurred. Who are you to tell us how to run our board? Susan's voice had risen to a level I'd call shrill. I'm an observer from the state HOA regulatory office, and I'm here to ensure that proper procedures are followed. If you'd prefer, we can postpone this hearing and conduct a formal investigation instead. The other board members shifted uncomfortably. Robert whispered something to Kenneth, who whispered something back. Susan took a breath, visibly trying to calm herself. Fine. Let's hear from the complainant. She pulled out her phone and made a call. Nancy, can you come to the community center? We need you to testify. A pause. Yes, now. 5 minutes later, Nancy Patterson walked in. She lived 3 houses down from me, a woman in her 60s who I'd maybe spoken to twice since moving in. She looked uncomfortable and kept glancing at Susan. Nancy, tell the board about the noise disturbances from Mr. Fletcher's property, Susan prompted. Nancy fidgeted with her purse strap. Well, I can hear his snowblower when he uses it. And how does that affect you? Susan asked. It's just loud, I suppose. I leaned forward. Mrs. Patterson, can you hear the HOA's landscaping crew when they work? Well, yes. And which is louder, my snowblower or their equipment? She hesitated. I suppose their equipment is louder, but that's different. How is it different? It just is. They're professionals. But in terms of the actual noise level and disturbance to your peace, which is worse? Nancy looked at Susan, then back at me. Honestly, the leaf blowers are terrible. I can't hear my TV when they're working, but your snowblower isn't that bad, really. Susan said it was important to report it. The room went silent. Susan's face had gone from red to purple. So you filed a complaint because Miss Fitzgerald asked you to, not because you were actually disturbed? I asked. I didn't mean to cause trouble, Nancy said quickly. Susan just said we needed to maintain standards. Patricia was taking notes on her tablet. The other audience members were whispering among themselves. "This is ridiculous," Susan sputtered. "Nancy, that's not what we discussed." "I'm sorry, Susan, but he asked me a direct question." "I'm not going to lie." I pulled out my professional decibel meter. "I have a proposal. Let's do a live test right now. We can go outside, I'll run my snowblower, and we can measure the actual noise level. Then next Tuesday when the landscaping crew comes, we can measure their equipment the same way. If my snowblower is louder than their equipment, I'll pay the fine. If it's quieter, the fine gets rescinded and the HOA agrees to stop selective enforcement." "We're not agreeing to anything," Susan said. "Why not?" Ted called out from the audience. "Seems fair to me." Other voices joined in agreement. Patricia stood up again. "Miss Fitzgerald, I think that's a reasonable proposal. It would provide objective evidence for the record." Susan looked around the room, seeing that public opinion had turned against her. "Fine. But if your machine is over 80 decibels, you pay double the fine." "Deal," I said. "But if it's under 80 and quieter than your landscaping equipment, you drop all fines and put in writing that electric snowblowers are permitted during legal hours." She nodded curtly, and we all filed outside into the cold March evening. There was still some snow on the ground from the last storm, enough for a demonstration. I'd brought my snowblower in my truck, anticipating this might happen. I set it up in the community center parking lot while Patricia positioned herself with her phone's decibel meter, and I set up my professional unit. Several other residents pulled out their phones too. "Everyone should stand about 15 feet away," I said. "That's a standard measurement distance for community noise." Once everyone was positioned, I fired up the snowblower. The familiar hum filled the air as I pushed it across a section of snow-covered pavement. After running it for about 30 seconds, I shut it off. "What did you get?" I asked Patricia. She checked her phone. 71 decibels. I checked my professional meter. 72 here. Slight variation between devices, but essentially the same. Susan had her arms crossed. "That doesn't seem that quiet to me." "Normal conversation is 60 to 70 decibels, I said. "A vacuum cleaner is typically 75. We're talking about the same noise level as someone talking in a moderately loud voice." "We'll see about the landscaping equipment," she said stubbornly. "Actually," Brenda said, and everyone turned to look at her, "I think we need to be realistic here. I can hear the landscaping crew from inside my house with the windows closed. I've never heard Sam's snowblower unless I was outside." Susan shot her a look that could have melted the remaining snow. "You're supposed to support the board." "I'm supposed to be fair," Brenda said quietly, "and this isn't fair." Over the next few days, I received calls from 3 different neighbors expressing support. Apparently, Susan had been running the HOA like her personal fiefdom for 5 years, and people were getting tired of it. The incident with my snowblower was just the latest in a long series of petty enforcement actions that seemed designed more to assert control than to actually maintain the neighborhood. The following Tuesday, I made sure to be ready when the landscaping crew arrived at 6:30 a.m. Patricia Chen showed up too, along with Ted and about 6 other curious neighbors. We stood near the common area with our decibel meters ready. When the crew fired up their commercial-grade leaf blowers, the noise was immediate and overwhelming. The meters jumped. 94 decibels, Patricia announced. 96 here, I said, checking my professional unit. The riding mower was next. 89 decibels. We documented everything with multiple witnesses and multiple meters showing consistent readings. The landscaping equipment was routinely 20 to 25 decibels louder than my electric snowblower. I compiled everything into a formal report and submitted it to both the HOA board and Patricia's office. Within a week, I received a notice that the emergency board meeting had been called to discuss the findings. This meeting was much different from the first. For one thing, twice as many residents showed up. For another, Patricia brought a colleague from the state office, an older man named Richard Torres, who introduced himself as a senior compliance officer. Susan tried to maintain control, but the room's energy had shifted. When she called the meeting to order, Robert Davidson immediately made a motion to rescind my fines. Kenneth seconded it. The vote was 4-1, with only Susan voting against, but we weren't done. Ted stood up during the public comment period. I have a complaint to file against the HOA board for selective enforcement and harassment. 3 other residents stood up with similar complaints. It turned out Susan had been targeting multiple homeowners with spurious violations over the years. One man had been fined for having his basketball hoop 6 inches too far into his driveway. A woman had been cited for having the wrong shade of white paint on her fence, even though she'd used the exact color specified in the bylaws. Another family had been fined for their children's chalk drawings on their own driveway. Patricia and Richard took notes on everything. After the public comments, Richard stood up. Based on what I've heard tonight and the complaints we've received, the state HOA office will be conducting a full audit of Pinewood Hills HOA. This will include a review of all enforcement actions taken over the past 3 years, financial records, and compliance with state HOA regulations. Susan's face had gone pale. That's not necessary. We run a perfectly legal operation. That's what the audit will determine, Richard said calmly. We'll be in touch about scheduling. Over the next few weeks, things moved fast. The state audit uncovered some disturbing patterns. Susan had been using HOA funds to hire a private investigator to dig up dirt on homeowners she didn't like. She'd also been manipulating violation notices, sometimes issuing them for violations that didn't exist or for rules she'd made up herself. But the worst discovery was that Susan and Kenneth had been embezzling HOA funds. They'd set up a fake landscaping company and had been billing the HOA inflated rates, then pocketing the difference. Over 3 years, they'd stolen nearly $40,000. When that news broke, the neighborhood erupted. An emergency meeting was called, and the residents voted unanimously to remove Susan and Kenneth from the board. Brenda became the interim president, and she immediately instituted new policies about transparency and fairness. The criminal investigation took a bit longer. I was interviewed by a detective from the Colorado Springs Police Department's Financial Crimes Unit. I provided all my documentation about the selective enforcement, which helped establish the pattern of abuse that led investigators to dig deeper into the finances. In June, Susan Fitzgerald and Kenneth Walsh were arrested and charged with theft, embezzlement, and fraud. The arrest made the local news, and I watched from my living room as Susan was led out of her house in handcuffs, still protesting that she'd done nothing wrong. The legal proceedings took months, but eventually, both Susan and Kenneth pleaded guilty to avoid trial. Susan was sentenced to 18 months in prison and ordered to repay her share of the stolen money. Kenneth got 1 year and similar restitution requirements. Both were banned from serving on any HOA board in Colorado. The neighborhood started to feel different after that. Brenda organized a community barbecue in July, and nearly everyone showed up. People who'd been afraid to talk about their issues with the old board suddenly felt free to speak up and participate. The HOA actually started functioning like it was supposed to, maintaining common areas, enforcing reasonable rules fairly, and fostering community. I continued using my electric snowblower through the next winter without any complaints. In fact, Several neighbors asked me about it and ended up buying similar models. The new board even passed a resolution explicitly allowing electric snow removal equipment during reasonable hours, defining those hours clearly in the bylaws. Ted and I became good friends. We started a neighborhood watch program that was actually about looking out for each other, not spying on each other. His kids used my driveway for skateboarding practice, and I didn't mind at all. Nancy Patterson apologized to me multiple times. She brought over homemade cookies and explained that she'd felt pressured by Susan, who had a way of making people feel like they had to go along with her demands. I told her I understood and didn't hold it against her. Her testimony, intentional or not, had been crucial in exposing the truth. The following spring, Brenda asked if I'd consider joining the board. "We need people who are willing to stand up for what's right," she said. "And you certainly proved you can do that." I agreed, and at the annual meeting in May, I was elected to the board along with 2 other new members who'd been vocal about reform. Our first action was to completely rewrite the enforcement procedures to include clear standards, objective measurements when possible, and a fair appeal process. We also fired the landscaping company and hired a new one that used electric equipment. It cost slightly more, but the reduction in noise was dramatic. The neighborhood became quieter, more peaceful, and people actually started spending more time outside without being driven away by the roar of gas-powered leaf blowers. Looking back on the whole ordeal, I realized it had never really been about the snowblower. It had been about power and control, about someone who'd gotten used to pushing people around and couldn't handle being challenged. Susan had seen the HOA as her personal kingdom, and any resistance to her authority was treated as a threat. The decibel test had been the objective evidence that cut through all the subjective complaints and personal vendettas. Numbers don't lie, and when confronted with actual data showing that my equipment was quieter than the HOA's own equipment, there was no way to maintain the fiction that I was the problem. I learned a lot from the experience. I learned that documentation is crucial, that objective evidence matters, and that standing up to bullies is worth it even when it's uncomfortable. I also learned that most people are reasonable when given the facts, and that communities function better when they're based on fairness rather than fear. The professional decibel meter I'd bought for $300 turned out to be one of the best investments I'd ever made. It now sat on a shelf in my garage, a reminder of what you can accomplish when you refuse to back down from injustice and arm yourself with facts. By my second winter in Pinewood Hills, the neighborhood had completely transformed. We had monthly community meetings where people actually wanted to attend and participate. We started a community garden, organized holiday events, and even launched a neighborhood newsletter that focused on positive news rather than violation notices. The legal requirement that every resident maintain their property was still enforced, but it was done fairly and with reasonable standards. If someone's grass got too long, they got a friendly reminder first, not an immediate fine. If there was a legitimate issue, board members would often knock on the door and have a conversation rather than sending intimidating letters. One Saturday morning in December, I was out clearing my driveway after another overnight snowfall when my new neighbor, who just moved in across the street into Susan's old house, came over. "Hey, I'm Dave Martinez," he said, extending a gloved hand. "Just wanted to introduce myself." "Sam Fletcher, welcome to the neighborhood." "Thanks, I was wondering about that snowblower. Where'd you get it? I need to get something for my driveway," I smiled. "There's actually a funny story about this snowblower." "Oh yeah? Yeah." It led to the previous HOA president being arrested for embezzlement. Dave's eyes widened. "You're joking." "Nope, Come over for coffee later and I'll tell you the whole story, he laughed. I definitely want to hear this. As I finished clearing my driveway that morning, I thought about how one small act of resistance had snowballed into real change. If I just paid that first $500 fine like Ted suggested, Susan and Kenneth might still be running the HOA, stealing money, and making everyone's lives miserable. Instead, by standing up for myself and backing it up with evidence, I'd helped expose a corrupt system. The next board meeting was scheduled for that evening, and I'd been reviewing the agenda. We were discussing plans for updating the community center, reviewing the budget, and considering a proposal to install electric vehicle charging stations in the guest parking area. Normal, boring HOA stuff that actually benefited residents. Brenda had become an excellent president. She was fair, transparent, and actually cared about serving the community rather than ruling over it. At the last meeting, she joked that we should create an award for most improved HOA in Colorado and give it to ourselves. Everyone had laughed, but there was truth behind the joke. The meeting that evening went smoothly. We approved the charging stations, allocated funds for repainting the community center, and discussed organizing a summer concert series in the park. After we adjourned, several residents came up to thank the board for the work we were doing. An older woman named Helen, who'd lived in Pinewood Hills for 15 years, grabbed my arm as I was leaving. You know, this is the first time in years that I've actually felt like this neighborhood belongs to the residents and not to the HOA. Thank you for what you did. I just wanted to clear my driveway, I said with a smile. You did a lot more than that, dear. Driving home that night, I reflected on how much had changed in less than 2 years. A neighborhood that had been ruled by fear and pettiness had become a genuine community. People knew each other's names, helped each other out, and weren't afraid of getting harassment notices for minor infractions. The legal proceedings had finally concluded the previous month. Susan had been released to a halfway house after serving 13 months, and Kenneth had finished his sentence as well. Both were required to complete community service and remain on probation for 3 years. The restitution payments would continue for years to come. I occasionally wondered what Susan thought about it all now. Did she understand that her need for control had destroyed her life? Did she see how her actions had hurt people? Or did she still believe she'd been in the right, just enforcing rules and maintaining standards? I'd never know the answer, and I supposed it didn't really matter. What mattered was that the neighborhood had moved on and become better for it. The following summer, we organized a block party to celebrate the community's transformation. Nearly every household participated, bringing food, games, and decorations. Kids ran around playing while adults chatted and laughed. Even the most introverted residents came out, drawn by the genuine sense of community. Ted stood at the grill flipping burgers and told anyone who'd listen about how I'd taken down the evil empire with a snowblower and a decibel meter. It had become a neighborhood legend, slightly exaggerated with each retelling. Tell them about the hearing, Ted's wife encouraged. Tell them about when Nancy accidentally admitted Susan had pressured her. I laughed and recounted the story for what felt like the 100th time. People never seemed to get tired of hearing it. Dave Martinez, my neighbor from across the street, had bought an electric snowblower exactly like mine. So had 4 other families on the street. That winter, we'd formed an informal snow removal club, helping elderly neighbors and people who were out of town. The quiet hum of electric motors had become the soundtrack of winter mornings in Pinewood Hills. The community garden we'd started had flourished, providing fresh vegetables for dozens of families, and becoming a gathering place where people would work together and share gardening tips. The newsletter had grown into a popular monthly publication with recipes, neighborhood news, and profiles of interesting residents. Everything that Susan had tried to control and micromanage had actually improved once residents were free to organize themselves naturally. The neighborhood looked better, functioned better, and people were genuinely happy to live there. I served 2 terms on the HOA board before stepping down to make room for new voices. During that time, we'd established clear, fair policies that would continue long after any individual board member was gone. We'd also instituted term limits to prevent anyone from accumulating too much power or staying in position too long. 3 years after the snowblower incident, I received a letter from Patricia Chen at the state HOA office. She was writing to let me know that our case had been used as a model example in new training materials for HOA board members across Colorado. The documentation I'd provided, the decibel testing methodology, and the way the situation had been resolved were all being taught as best practices. Your case demonstrated the importance of objective standards, transparent enforcement, and proper documentation, she wrote. It also showed what can happen when one person stands up against unfair treatment. Thank you for your role in making HOAs in Colorado more accountable and fair. I put the letter in a frame and hung it in my home office, next to a photo from that first community barbecue after Susan's arrest. The photo showed dozens of smiling neighbors, people who'd been freed from living in fear of petty violations and arbitrary enforcement. My electric snowblower, the machine that had started it all, still sat in my garage. I'd kept it in perfect working condition, and it ran just as quietly as the day I'd bought it. Every time I used it, I remembered that sometimes the most important battles are the ones you fight over small things, because those small things reveal larger truths. The neighborhood kids had nicknamed me Snowblower Sam, which made me laugh every time I heard it. They didn't know the full story, just that I was somehow famous for my snow removal equipment. Their parents knew the truth, though, and I'd caught more than a few of them teaching their kids about the importance of standing up for what's right, using my story as an example. As winter returned for a 5th time since I'd moved to Pinewood Hills, I found myself grateful for that morning when Susan had marched across the street to confront me. If she hadn't, I might have just gone along with the status quo, paying unjust fines and accepting unfair treatment like so many before me. Instead, I'd fought back with the best weapons available: facts, documentation, and persistence. I'd exposed corruption, helped reform a broken system, and inadvertently built a real community in the process. The decibel meter still sat on its shelf, occasionally borrowed by neighbors who needed to measure something for various projects. It had become a sort of neighborhood talisman, a reminder of what could be accomplished with objective evidence and determination. I never did see Susan again after her arrest. She'd sold her house while awaiting trial, and I heard she'd moved somewhere out of state after her release. Part of me hoped she'd learned something from the experience and was living a better life. But mostly, I just felt grateful that she was gone and couldn't hurt anyone else in our community. The neighborhood continued to thrive, and new residents moving in would often ask about the story of the HOA transformation. It had become part of the community's identity, a shared history that bonded us together. I still cleared my driveway with my electric snowblower every time it snowed, and now I did it without worry or stress. The simple act of maintaining my property, something that should have always been straightforward, was finally just that: simple. Looking back on everything, I realized that the entire ordeal had taught me something fundamental about power, community, and justice. Power unchecked will always tend toward abuse. Communities built on fear will never truly flourish. And justice requires people willing to stand up and fight for it, even when the battle seems small or petty. My fight hadn't been about saving the world. It had been about the right to clear my driveway with equipment that was demonstrably quieter than the HOA's own machines. But in standing up for that small right, I'd helped topple a corrupt system and free an entire neighborhood from tyranny. Sometimes the most important revolutions start with the smallest acts of defiance. Mine started with an electric snowblower and a decibel meter. And in the end, that was enough to change everything.